Hey there, Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, today's video was suggested to me over on the Discord server. It's called, Is Every Civilization Doomed to Fail? Now, it says that this is by Gregory Aldrete, and the description says that he is a PhD professor at the University of Wisconsin in Green Bay with a PhD in ancient history from the University of Michigan. Now, the channel is After School, and I don't think I've ever seen or heard of them before, but popular channel with 3.6 million subs, and this video in the last 6 months has 1.7 million views. So I'm excited to check this out. All right, the original video is down below. Make sure you're supporting that. By the way, it might be a good idea to enable notifications. I know you don't want to get a whole bunch of alerts on YouTube, but if you like what I do here, there's a good chance my stuff is not coming through your suggestions feed, just because I upload so much basically daily, and it doesn't want to bombard that. All right, let's check this out though. All right, so the premise is every civilization doomed to fail, just off the dome here. I don't know about doomed to fail, but doomed to change, I would say yes. Fail, like collapse or something, just like cease to exist. I mean, that doesn't always happen. They change. There is all kinds of assimilation and cultural diffusion, immigration, all these different elements, especially as time goes on. But let's see what we got. After School. I spelled school wrong. Video discredited.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of After School. My name is Greg Aldrete, and I'm a history professor who studies ancient Greece and Rome. Today, we'll be exploring the theories of the ancient Greek historian Polybius,
at the University of New Mexico.
Why civilizations rise and fall, as well as what explains the astonishing success of the Roman Republic. So, let's get started.
Yeah. Longest lasting semi-democratic institution, I guess you would say. Republic, we can have a long debate about, of them as a republic, because there were a lot of limitations and requirements to participate in such thing or to be in active government. But 500 years basically as a republic before it goes empire mode, which is another interesting thing. Are all republics either doomed to be destroyed or turn into empires or authoritarian? What do you think about that? By the way, these comments and stuff that he's makes, I love to hear what you guys have to say down in the comment section.
Is every civilization doomed to rise, but then inevitably fall? Is there some ideal form of government that will allow a civilization to avoid collapse?
Probably not.
How can we explain why some civilizations flourish and expand, while others stagnate or are easily conquered?
Interested to hear what he says.
These are vital questions that humans have pondered for thousands of years, and they remain urgently relevant today.
One thing we do a lot in my classes, and really kind of make it required, is comparing, contrasting sort of the rise and fall of like dynasties, of states, and seeing a lot of the parallels and some of the differences. You do find a lot, and we'll see what's going on here. And I'll try to maybe interject a little bit with some of the things that we've kind of come across as students and educators.
They were also the exact questions that obsessed a man named Polybius, who lived in ancient Greece over 2,000 years ago during the 2nd century BC.
Shout out to ancient Athens.
While Polybius
dead,
was a highly educated member of the Greek upper class, for him, these were not just abstract philosophical topics to be debated over a cup of wine, but burning issues of direct and painful relevance, not only to himself personally, but to his home city of Megalopolis and to the entire wider Greek world. This is because during Polybius's lifetime, the Roman Republic had gone on a rampage through the Greek world, defeating one state after another, including Polybius's own city of Megalopolis.
Do you think there's irony in that some of the early Roman people, I guess, were basically migrants from Greece? They were people that moved from Greece into Rome as it was coming down. But Rome was kind of a hodgepodge of like indigenous, like Etruscan culture, but then, Greek culture as well.
In 167 BC, Polybius was shipped off as a hostage to Rome, along with 1,000 other prominent Greeks. All of this came as a devastating shock to Polybius.
One thing that the Romans did do was they kept a lot of things that the Greeks were sort of good at to them, like the scientific world. They left a lot of that to the Greeks. Kind of like, okay, let them keep kind of doing their thing. They're cooking over there. Let's let them kind of do that. By the way, that's one thing that maybe when he was talking about things that help civilizations to thrive is allowing that, like basically allowing the people and the places that are good at certain things to keep doing those. I think that could be maybe a feature. What do you think of that? All right, Alexander time.
All of this came as a devastating shock to Polybius.
He was already dead, though.
Over a century earlier, the conquests of Alexander the Great, king of Macedon, had spread Greek culture throughout the Eastern Mediterranean
Hellenism.
And into the Near East. Although Alexander's empire had fragmented upon his death into numerous smaller kingdoms,
the influence spread, though.
Culture remained dominant.
For sure.
Giving many Greeks a smug sense of superiority.
Well, it assimilated a lot, and he kind of imposed some of that, the assimilation of those cultures. So he'd conquer a place, destroy it, because he was a devastating conqueror, and then kind of rebuild it a lot in a Greek image. A lot of these cities and things that he would rebuild, he'd make them off of Greek models, where they'd have an agora, the central marketplaces, and then they would have like theaters, gymnasiums, those sort of things that bring that culture with it. But there was assimilation, meaning like combination of those cultures. And you saw that spread, and it was like scientifically and mathematically and all types of intellectual, I guess, curiosities really thrived, because if you connected like Egypt, Persia, and Greece, which all had certain things that they were good at, and also, derived from other people. A lot of the Persians had gotten things like, say, from India. But anyway, the dissemination of all that information really facilitated as a result of this like Hellenistic empire that Alexander, helped to create.
After all, were they not the creators of such magnificent achievements as the architectural perfection of temples like the Parthenon?
Sure.
The sculpted beauty of statues such as the Doryphorus? The clever...
By the way, most of this, when you talk about Greek art, very influenced by the Egyptians. The Greeks loved the Egyptians, especially when it came to culture, art, and architecture. That was their, that's who they looked up to. If the Romans looked up to, say, the Greeks, the Greeks, they looked up to the Egyptians.
For plays of Sophocles and the brilliant philosophy of Plato. The period after Alexander's conquest was known as the Hellenistic era, and during it, the erudition and ingenuity of Greek culture, coupled with the ruthlessness of the Macedonian military machine, seemed an unbeatable combination.
So the phalanx, military folks that are in here that know a lot about this. Were there spears? What are they called? Sarissas? Is that what they were called? Were they really this long? What was the length of those? They had the pikes, which again was kind of the forward part of the phalanx. Phalanx is a very well-trained, integrated sort of like battle group, and they would use their shields and then their pikes there, and they were very difficult to defeat because they were defended as well as they could be offensive like this. But like these pikes are like, I don't know, 20 feet.
The Hellenistic cities and empires of the Eastern Mediterranean were wealthy, prosperous, sophisticated, and self-satisfied. And then this world was turned upside down. Onto this complacent scene burst the Romans, who swept in from the Western Mediterranean and in little more than a generation toppled nearly every one of the mighty Hellenistic kingdoms. To many Greeks, the Romans would have seemed uncouth barbarians.
Except not Persia. They take over Egypt. That was later. That was a lot later, too. Greeks, fairly early on. Did give them some autonomy, though.
To many Greeks, the Romans would have seemed uncouth barbarians, utterly lacking in the intellectual skills and accomplishments that they prize so highly.
Let's be fair. The Greeks thought of everybody that wasn't Greek as barbarian. That's where the term is said to have come from, the root word barbaroi, which basically, from what I understand, meant anybody that didn't speak Greek was basically seen as barbaric.
How could such relative brutes have triumphed so rapidly over the talented and powerful Greeks?
Lack of Greek unification.
This riddle was so compelling.
We've seen it many times.
That he devoted the rest of his life to trying to answer it. His investigation took the form of writing a gigantic 40-volume history of Rome, in which he meticulously described Rome's expansion across the Mediterranean and offered his analysis of Rome's spectacular success. He lays out his motivation right at the beginning of his history, stating, "Can there be anyone so apathetic or lacking in curiosity to have no desire to understand by what means and under what form of government the Romans conquered the entire inhabited world and brought it under their absolute control in a time span of barely 53 years.
Amazing, because it's as a republic. This is before Roman Empire time. Rome was an empire before it was a republic. That makes sense? And when we talk about empire, the term I would identify as like a diversity of subject peoples. They were doing that as a republic of senators.
Polybius was perhaps uniquely qualified to undertake such a project, because he acquired first-hand knowledge of Roman imperialism, not only from his perspective as one of its victims, but also from the Roman viewpoint as well. Polybius ultimately spent 16 years as a hostage at Rome, where he was treated more like a guest than a prisoner.
Sure.
While there, he became
taking their influential people, using them, getting insight, that kind of thing. Oh, did he mentor Scipio?
Friends with the most powerful Roman family of the day, the Scipios. Polybius accompanied
I don't know a lot about
Roman
Polybius.
Generals on campaigns in Africa and Spain, and thus, when it came to analyzing the fall of the Greek world and the rise of Rome,
see some Carthage
Polybius
stuff
had
here.
Truly witnessed both sides. Before looking at Polybius's explanation for the rise of Rome, we need to examine his overall ideas about how and why civilizations rise and fall.
Okay. So he has
like many ancient
thesis
thinkers,
about it.
Polybius believed that civilizations behaved like living creatures and followed a natural biological cycle of birth, growth, maturity, stagnation, decline, and death.
Well, yeah, I mean, but it's, not one person. You're passing a torch on, overlapping over generation after generation.
The earlier Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, had both expressed versions of this theory. Polybius took these ideas even further and offered a very elaborate scheme. He proposed a cyclical progression of 7 stages of government that form an endless repeating loop called anacyclosis.
Okay, this is actually really cool, because I was talking about how, things change, right? They don't necessarily always just are like doomed to fail, but they change. And using the analogy or the example of Rome going from, republic that was basically acting like an empire with a pretty strong authoritative structure without maybe one person at its head. But we also know the Senate was ruled by some very, a handful of very powerful families. But okay, this is super interesting to me. Take notes, everybody. We're having a quiz at the end. The cycles, the 7 steps of the cycle.
That primitive humans had begun in a sort of anarchic original condition without political structures. This is the first stage.
No, I mean, all of these places did have political structures, chieftains, that kind of thing. At most, maybe councils. They weren't just some kind of anarchy of individuals. In fact, it's the societal cooperation that allowed these groups to survive rather than die out. So they non-government, not really. That's basically never been a thing.
Eventually, a strong leader emerges who brings order and direction for the good of all.
Can't be councils,
and thereby
though.
Gains the respect and fealty of the group. The people willingly bestow the mantle of authority upon him, and thus we reach the second stage of the cycle, kingship.
Okay.
While the original king earned his position of leadership through his actions, the kingship was usually then passed down by heredity. Over time, subsequent monarchs start to grow arrogant and abuse their power through arbitrary or unjust actions, and the kingship degenerates into the third phase, tyranny.
Okay. Interesting so far. If we're saying this is like a straight line, even though, with a circle, I guess, without other branches to it, there are other ways. There are places that have, may have kingships, but they are like elected leaders. Some of those have existed. Some of those happen in like Mesopotamia, for example. They would come out of some of these early kings as especially like good at warfare. And so much of what makes a king important and supported is based off of the conditions of the people there. If you're in a place that is in constant competition from other types of people, then you're going to have a lot of warfare. So the key feature that you're going to want of your leader is skill in battle and organizing in battle, because that's the most important thing to your safety. If it's a place that maybe doesn't have that as much, then it's going to be something else. How about being able to provide, say, food for people? So like land ownership, that could be something, because everybody needs food to survive and food needs land. So you develop kind of naturally like an aristocracy that ways. By the way, ancient Greece is a great way to study governments, because different city-states had different needs, kind of like the ones that I've told you thus far, and develop different government styles with that, with aristocracies, oligarchies, monarchies, and their sort of evolution can change depending on the circumstances. But okay, so tyranny.
This provokes a group of the wealthiest and most dynamic men to organize together and overthrow the tyrant. They then take charge of running the state in a collective fashion, sharing power among themselves. And the fourth phase, aristocracy, is born.
Well, sometimes you could have aristocracy before like kingship. You can have that, especially if power is dispersed a lot. If there's basically the more access to important resources, there's going to be the likelihood that you can be having multiple types of leaders, right? In certain city-states, for example, like mass agriculture is not going to be as possible. So if you actually can own and operate like important parts of land, you're naturally going to become very powerful. Something similar happened in the evolution of society, like in Japan. Japan is 4/5 mountains. So the really good land is going to be very important. And whoever, comes through in controlling that is going to be important. You can see that, like Athens, for example. They actually kind of started as a monarchy, then they actually kind of went more like this, which is interesting, of starting probably more as a monarchy, but then as it grew and there were more forms of wealth, therefore more forms of power, whether it's by trade or it's by land ownership and agriculture. And then that's how they ended up getting a democracy, essentially, is there was so much abundance in that way and so many different forms of having wealth and wealth as power that they had to pretty much expand it to a larger percentage of the population in other places. Okay. But I do want to, of course, do the caveat that Greek or Athenian democracy, because the other Greeks didn't really, not many of them did it to the extent that Athens ever did. That whole Greek democratic golden age was very short. We're talking like 50 years between the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. It was a minority in their history of having that type of democratic ability for people, which still was not the majority of people living in Athens, by the way.
While the initial group of aristocrats acts with the interests of all in mind, once again, over subsequent generations, their descendants become addicted to wealth and status and begin to think only of themselves.
Yeah.
And aristocracy degenerates into its corrupt form, oligarchy.
Okay. We might be using different terms. Aristocracy has also been used synonymously, which is basically the ruled by elite, a handful of elite people. And what you often see different between aristocracy and oligarchy, though, is similar in fashion that it's usually a handful of elite people, where historically aristocracy meaning more like landowners, okay, owning, controlling land itself, but oligarchy in more of its hand of its more like material wealth. So like in Athens, for example, which you could have oligarchy being very powerful. They aren't just wealthy based off of like land resources, but also trade. They were a trading place. So there's another form of income, or I guess wealth, being created from trade that can make you powerful as well. So we'll see. I guess he's using aristocracy in a larger sense, and then oligarchy meaning, I'm trying to follow here, he's not really, loading it to the business class, which you can kind of see by the little, drawings there. But I guess just more of a more selfish group, I guess.
The ordinary people inevitably grow weary of the abuses of the overbearing oligarchs and reach a point where they can't take it anymore. The people rise up in revolution and either kill or expel the oligarchs.
So now we're getting into some like Marxist hypothesis here, that they were saying that the society is going to be so dominated by a small group of people, while the difficulties of common people will just continue to grow till you do this. Now, Polybius is saying this. He's like original Marxist here. Now, Karl Marx he was also like advocating for it in a way, of this revolution against oligarchy. And to that was, industrial capitalism essentially. But okay.
Recalling their ill treatment by tyrants and oligarchs,
to a democracy now, or what?
Neither a kingship nor an aristocracy. This inspires them to take up the reins of government themselves and create a democracy in which political power rests in the hands of the people. Equality and freedom of speech typically form two of the cornerstones of democracies.
Some of you guys that have done even deeper level Marxist study than me, was Marx at all directly inspired by some of Polybius's arguments here? Because this cycle is something that you see kind of in Marx works. Difference being the perspectives of being, almost 2,000 years apart.
For a time, there is harmony and prosperity, but soon corruption again creeps in. Later generations, who have grown up always enjoying freedom of speech and equality, begin to take these rights for granted and no longer guard or value them. Greed leads to inequality, and affluence fosters a sense of entitlement. Both create resentment among the populace. Deceitful and shameless leaders arise who play upon these feelings by making extravagant promises, vowing to shower the people with gifts. But in reality, these men are only concerned with increasing their own power.
It's interesting, too, because I'm also hearing some Socrates in here, and his criticisms of democracy, where basically just becoming powerful or getting a lot of support in democracy can simply just be done by throwing gifts to people, basically, without any long-term substantive value. Just give them the illusion of getting stuff and being appealing in that very kind of simple way. Have you ever heard the kind of analogy from Socrates, which would have come through Plato, about the doctor versus like the candy man? Let's say you have two candidates or something, and you have this one guy that's a doctor. And he is somebody that has studied, he is an expert on things, he knows how to treat people and that sort of thing. But then you have like the candy man, right? Now the candy man, what he excels in is giving people what they want. It might be unhealthy, it might be bad for them, and basically letting you indulge. And the sort of candy man guy, he accuses the doctor of doing things that hurt you. When he's trying to heal you, when the doctor's saying, no, this is good for you, and I know it's good for you to do this type of treatment. Yes, it might hurt you, but you need to trust me that this is going to be a good thing. And the Candyman can be like, no, I give you, freedom and indulgence. And this guy, he wants to harm you, and you just have to like believe him based on his authority, I guess. And we vote for more Candymen than we do the doctor. Get that metaphor? Another one he used was like as a ship captain. Let's say there's a storm and things are very tragic for us. Is democracy the right way to decide who should be in charge of the ship during basically the storm? Should we be voting on that? Or about like us as a people about how we handle this? Or should we rely on the ship captain that has the experience?
With the rise of such power-hungry and narcissistic leaders, often called demagogues, democracy devolves into the next phase, mob rule. At some point, one of the demagogues emerges as dominant over all the others and seizes control of the state, or else there is a general collapse into anarchy, followed by the emergence of a new strongman.
Where do you guys think feudalism plays into here? As with one of these processes? I mean, historically speaking, feudalism rose in Europe after the fall of Western Rome as the entity of and protection and rule of the Romans dwindled. power became more localized and people became, more directly reliant on a more localized ruler.
Then the entire cycle repeats itself. This is how Polybius described his doctrine of anacyclosis. And in his presentation,
what do you guys think?
There is indeed an almost biological inevitability to the way in which each stage degenerates into its negative twin. That Polybius would subscribe to this theory is quite understandable, because its general outlines matched up well against the histories of many of the Greek city-states.
Yeah, that's true.
For example, if we look at Athens, the largest and most famous of them,
it went through a lot of evolutions.
Aligns pretty well with the anacyclosis scheme.
Yeah. And that would have been something, Polybius' perspective would have been very important. When you're studying POV of authors, looking at their background information, it would make sense that way.
Its development aligns pretty well with the anacyclosis scheme. According to legend, its earliest rulers were wise kings, such as Theseus, who was renowned for slaying the half-bull, half-human monster known as the Minotaur.
He was the first king.
Then as Athens...
Oh, I didn't know the mythology there. He was the king, became the king of Athens.
Grew in power, human monster known as the Minotaur. Then as Athens grew in power and wealth, it went through a phase when it was ruled by tyrants. The arrogant behavior of these
By the way, tyrants, we use that term tyrant in usually like a very negative connotation, but that actually wasn't exactly how that was. It was somebody that might have like temporary power at a time, but wasn't necessarily synonymous with abuse. One of the famous examples of like a successful tyrant, if you know Athenian history, is Solon. Look into him, but was seen as like a good tyrant. And then also only ruled for a limited amount of time.
Tyrants caused them to be overthrown, and a group of aristocratic families assumed power. Over time, a series of institutional reforms shifted Athens towards an ever more democratic structure of government, culminating in the direct radical democracy of the mid-5th century BC, a time that also corresponded to the high point of Athenian power and wealth. Towards the end of
and that was their high point after the victory against the Persians, where you're going to get this. If that's what he's specifically referring to, at least what I've usually heard. Again, he's a PhD in ancient history, so talking about the 50 or so years, because that democratic high point did not really last that long before it was corrupted pretty quick. I mean, a couple generations.
The 5th century BC, however, unscrupulous politicians arose who, although pretending to be champions of the people, were really only interested in selfishly advancing their own careers.
Pericles.
These demagogues included men such as Alcibiades, who encouraged the Athenian people to vote for foolish policies that led to Athens' catastrophic defeat in the Peloponnesian War and the collapse of the Athenian Empire. During the next century...
I mean, Athens also overstretched themselves after the Persian Wars. I mean, they were using the Delian League, which was basically their unifying efforts to try to have a standing military force against Persia. And once the Persians stopped attacking, they basically used that military alliance to pretty much further their own selfish goals. You saw, weren't they like diverting money that was... So how it worked, kind of the city-states would all be members of this thing called the Delian League. And it was, think of it like the UN of ancient Greece, and you basically pay into it. It keeps a standing force because I don't know if the Persians are going to be back or not. I mean, you don't often know when wars are going to end that way. And, they're paying in, they're getting funding, and it rose them up in power. At a time where before the Persian Wars, the Greek city-states often didn't get along and they didn't really unify. They were more at odds with each other. But with the threat of the Persians, it definitely consolidated power into Athens. But they were using some of those funds, I think diverting some that Pericles had built, like the Acropolis and all the millions of dollars of today's money that would have been spent there. And people got wind of this around the rest of the city-states. They didn't they thought that there was this abuse of power and wealth by Athens. And there were plenty of people that had problems with Athens. And they're going to break apart from the Delian League. Sparta's going to have a role in this because, Sparta going to Sparta. And help them with the Peloponnesian League. So The Athenians also had some of these internal problems that were definitely amplified by probably some of their greed and some of their narcissism, I guess you would say.
Not just Athens, but all of Greece fell under the control of a new generation of kings, such as Alexander the Great and his successors, and the cycle seemed to have circled
It was really
back
seen
to
more
its
as
beginning.
a foreigner, though.
It's worth noting that innumerable later thinkers would be greatly influenced by Polybius's anacyclosis model, and
Marx?
would either comment on it or offer their own version.
Marx?
Among the more notable of these during the Middle Ages was Thomas Aquinas, the great philosopher, theologian, who wrote the Summa Theologica. During the Renaissance, Niccolo Machiavelli, the brilliant and infamous political commentator, best known for his treatise The Prince, was heavily influenced by Polybius, and in another of his writings, The Discourses, offered his own version of the anacyclosis cycle.
Well, and Machiavelli was a support of strong rule. He was kind of like the ends justify the means kind of thing. And it's like people are naturally like cruel, greedy, selfish, and you need strong rule to basically kind of keep people in check that way. And if it takes basically being a feared ruler, it's like that's okay.
During the 18th century, the intellectuals of the Enlightenment were fascinated with ideas about the progression of history, and many Enlightenment thinkers subscribed to Polybius's theory. In an essay called Men's Lust for Power, the American founding father John Adams directly echoed Polybius, writing, "Simple monarchy will soon mold itself into despotism. Aristocracy will soon commence an oligarchy, and democracy will soon degenerate into an anarchy."
our second president, he's just like, yep. He's like, in the end, I know we're making this new country here and stuff, but he's like even hypothesizing that we will become an anarchical state.
This concept affected...
I don't know if anarchy is just like the step. I don't know how long. I don't think anarchy also doesn't last long either. I think feudalism becomes the natural thing with political decentralization, because at some point you have to be able to survive, and you have to have a means by which to survive. And coalescing, at least at some part, is going to find itself to be more successful than anarchy. And if you look at it from almost like a biological, like evolution perspective, that which lends itself to more security and strength lends itself to being repeated more and more.
Adams so powerfully that he described it as the creed of my entire life.
So what does he advocate? What is he, in that sense, what is Adams advocating for? Just trying to maybe put in as many systems as possible that prevent democracy resulting in anarchy, I guess?
Leads back to the central puzzle that had motivated Polybius to write his history. Why had Rome been able to conquer the Hellenistic world so easily? His conclusion was that the Romans had cleverly found a way to step off the ever-revolving wheel of anacyclosis. How did they accomplish this? Rome had initially started out as a monarchy ruled by kings, but in the 6th century BC...
See, he never saw, though, the fall of the republic or the transition of a republic into empire, or obviously the fall of Rome itself. So this will be an interesting thing to see if he can like hypothesize well.
Initially started out as a monarchy ruled by kings, but in the 6th century BC had expelled them and established a republic dominated by aristocrats.
He never saw the empire part.
So far, this follows the anacyclosis model. However, by Polybius's time in the 2nd century BC, the Roman Republic had evolved into a kind of hybrid governmental structure that still retained some aristocratic elements, but also vested substantial power in the citizen body.
Well, the aristocrat, I mean, to be part of the Senate, you had to come from one of these aristocratic families, which was still a very, very small percentage when you look at actually the amount of people. So they definitely were not democratic in that way that, you know, anybody can be involved as directly as, say, maybe the direct democracy that Athens had, which still, again, was about 15% of people, because there were a lot of stipulations required to be a part of the democratic process.
And featured elected magistrates. Polybius believed that this version of the Roman Republic had managed to craft a constitution that mixed together elements of all three of the positive forms of government.
Is he saying that's good?
Kingship, aristocracy, and democracy. He thought that by blending these three forms together, the Romans had found a way to arrest their decay and avoid the dangerous and corrupting effects of their negative manifestations, tyranny, oligarchy, and mob rule.
So they did change, a bit over time with this. So he's about to show, one of the common things that broke down. But a lot of this had to change over time, too. They had to get some kind of checks and balances, what they're going to get with the tribunes later on. So the plebs, can have some kind of representation. So they change. That's why they're like, you're destined to change more and more. But maybe, again, I guess having these certain elements which have shown some success. I mean, when you look at an analysis of history, we've seen way more long-lasting and stable monarchies than we've ever seen democracies in history. And whatever you want to call Rome would still be considered an outlier.
Therefore, to Polybius, the factor that made the Romans different and accounted for their astonishing rise was the unique political structure of the Roman Republic.
Wasn't how it started, though.
He describes it in this.
This all came very slowly over time. They had to manipulate this because there'd be problems, and then they would respond to it. So, yeah.
As for the Constitution of Rome, it has three distinct components, each of them possessing political powers. These respective powers are parceled out, and the whole system regulated with such a scrupulous regard for equality and equilibrium that one cannot say for certain whether the Constitution on a whole is an aristocracy, a democracy, or a monarchy. If we focus our attention on the power of the consuls, these are the most important elected officials in Rome, we would be inclined to see the system as monarchical.
Well, and they had problems too, those consuls trying to act like kings almost, and they would also fight each other.
If we focus on the Senate, then it seems an aristocracy. And finally, if one considers the power possessed by the people in the Roman Constitution, it appears to be a democracy. Polybius is describing what today we might term a mixed constitution, a political system in which power is divided among different branches of government that are themselves controlled by different groups within society. There is more to Polybius's analysis,
like the whiteboard artwork, by the way.
Not only did the Roman Republic cleverly divide political power among these branches of government, but the three components were also bound together in a complex web of interdependency.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but with the tribunes supposed to be representing the common folk, their power was pretty much just limited to veto power, right? They didn't really present legislation, if I remember right. I know a lot of you big Rome guys, right? You think about Rome every day, right? Can help me on that one.
To quote Polybius again, whenever any one of the three branches of government becomes overbearing and displays an inclination to be contentious and encroach upon the others, the mutual interdependency of all three and the possibility of the ambitions of any one of them being checked or blocked by the others curbs this tendency. And so the proper equilibrium is always maintained.
By the way, for modern governments, of the things that have been inspired by Roman government, which in Western governments, a lot of people will derive a lot of things from, at least their interpretations of Greek and then Roman government, was the checks and balances thing. That was a good thing that Rome had, at least at a time, and at least that's to some level, being an important thing, among other Roman law principles and stuff.
To Polybius, this was the secret strength of the Roman Republic, that its political structure managed to capture the best elements of three different forms of government and fuse them together into a dynamic but balanced whole. One can debate.
Now, what about, though, the idea that you're talking about the Senate as this body that can check the consuls? But what about the idea that those senators, to be qualified to be a senator, required a lot of things that limited a lot of people, especially if it's like land ownership or coming from these like noble families? A little bit of that. Was Polybius a proponent of that? Now, in other times too, I remember in like the United States, you had to be a landowner originally to be able to vote. The idea was that justified that about why these certain elite higher class aristocratic families could bring in those politicians, with the fact that because of their advantages they had in society, they had a much more likelihood of like being educated. They could afford, because of their family's prominence, to go to schools and be elected literates and read about law and theory and economics and history and all that stuff, thereby kind of propelling you to be a better candidate self. Where if you came from maybe like a plebeian family, or maybe you had some kind of mild educational access, you didn't have it to the level that some of these elite families had. That would have been kind of one of the things that they were just basically be able to be groomed as better governors because of their access to higher education.
How accurate Polybius's assessment of the Roman constitution was.
Right.
However, in a world in which the current states were mostly monarchies, there was indeed something unusual about the
probably seemed really progressive
of the Roman Republic
at that time.
If the idea of a government that divides power among three main branches and employs a system of checks and balances sounds very familiar, especially to Americans, it should.
So yeah, again, it inspired Enlightenment thinkers. We have something like this, like from Montesquieu or something about different branches of government. You can see that, definitely that trajectory.
The education of America's founding fathers was deeply steeped in classical authors.
They like Solon too, didn't? Was it Washington that was like a big Solon fan? Am I remembering that right?
Was deeply steeped in classical authors, including Polybius, whose comments on the Roman Republic were among the key influences on the founders of the American Republic. As we've already seen, John Adams was particularly fond of Polybius, frequently quoting him in his speeches and essays, and directly stating that they were an inspiration when drafting the Constitution of the United States. Adams was not alone in his appreciation for Polybius's account of the structure of the Roman Republic. Thomas Jefferson considered an understanding of Polybius so essential that during the Constitutional Convention, he sent a copy of Polybius's history to James Madison for him to study. So,
James Madison was developed the framework for the Constitution, by the way.
Polybius correct in his belief that the Romans had solved the puzzle of how to stop the cycle by finding the ideal form of government. Keep in mind that Polybius himself lived at the height of the Roman Republic's success in the 2nd century BC.
POV is very important.
Unfortunately, beginning about a century later, during the period known as the Late Roman Republic, the system that Polybius so admired would begin to malfunction and eventually implode. It turned out...
Well, however, though, didn't he also predict that this would happen if he was talking about this cycle? I mean, I would think he didn't think that Rome was going to be immune to it. I mean, maybe he did, if you guys know Polybius more. Because if he has that cycle and he says this isn't going to last. Unless he was trying to just say that because they had all these elements that this thing would just be rock solid forever.
That the Roman solution was not permanent. The Roman Republic did eventually collapse.
Well,
even worse.
You still had a Senate kind of, but not with as much power. And then it just became, they, advised the emperor, I guess. So they changed. But then some people might say that was brought in even more success. Okay, the first couple hundred years for the Roman Empire, the Pax Romana, and that's supposed to be the golden age here.
When it did fail during the 1st century BC, it more or less followed the anacyclosis model. Resentments built up among many different groups within Roman society, including veterans, allies, half-citizens, poor citizens, and even some aristocrats, each of whom felt that they were not fairly sharing in the benefits and wealth that Rome's conquest had produced. The last century of the Republic witnessed the rise of a series of demagogic leaders. Men like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Julius Caesar
consuls too
progressively undermined the institutions and traditions of the Republic and placed their own personal interests above the good of the state.
What also became important for these guys is they're going to assume higher and higher political leadership is the military support that they had. So a guy like Caesar, for example, like Pompey, having an arm of force at your disposal is also a vehicle where this like despotism or whatever can probably has to come from, is having some kind of arm of force at your disposal. So is that one of the issues? You need to separate the military from the politics. That if you do that, then you have the government versus the military, say like Imperial Japan of the World War II era, where they just weren't working together.
They manipulated the common people, raised private armies, and when they disagreed with political rivals, replaced debate or compromise with violence and bloodshed. A round of civil wars ultimately led to the emergence of a new strongman who vanquished all his foes and became a king-like figure, the emperor, a system that would persist for the rest of Roman history. The first of these emperors was a grandnephew of Julius Caesar named Octavian, later known as Augustus once he becomes emperor.
Right.
His rule marks the death of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire.
Now, they say the Senate kind of gave him that power too, that it was like not by force in that way, that it kind of was handed to him, and him being right. I mean, that's the folklore story. He was like, I don't know if I should be like the emperor or something, but I guess I'll accept it.
It might seem that Rome's special mixed constitution only temporarily managed to arrest the turning of the anacyclosis wheel, and that in the end, the Roman Republic fell prey to all the usual ills predicted by Polybius's scheme. The collapse of the Roman Republic was a complex and prolonged process. Not all scholars agree that it follows Polybius's model, and it is certainly possible to debate this issue. But regardless of how closely you think the Roman Republic followed the anacyclosis paradigm, there is no doubt that it does offer a useful and provocative method for analyzing history. The basic question that it poses regarding whether or not civilizations are doomed to fall is a timeless one that all states, including modern ones, have to confront.
From the cycle here, then, I mean, it may be like an analysis that way, but does it propose something? Does it propose a good system or something like that? Is it just from the Polybius perspective, where it's just like get elements of each of those, and then all of a sudden that's going to be like the best thing for you? Or again, you make arguments for all different parts of the cycle that this is the best or most fair or whatever. Of course, that's going to depend on your position in life about which one of these cycles is going to be, or which parts of these cycles is the most beneficial.
That all states, including modern ones, have to confront. If Polybius's 2,000-year-old writings can provide a tool that enables us to better grapple with these fundamental questions, then they certainly deserve to be remembered and studied. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to learn more about ancient history or myself, please check out my website, my books, or the various audio and video courses that I made, the Great Courses / the teaching.
Looks like he's a Rome guy. He is a Rome guy. Okay, cool.
Company. Those are available from Audible, Apple Books, Amazon, and directly from the Great Courses. Thanks very much for watching. And remember, it's easier to make sense of the present if you know about the past.
I am so glad he said that. That's what I say all the time. When you are beginning your school year to students, right? You're a young person. You're like, why do we have to know this thing about dead people? It's like, no, it explains how the world works today. And if you want to be able to navigate today's complex world, you have to have an understanding of history, or you will suffer. All right. Final thoughts. All right. That was really fun. And I think informative for me to look at that cycle and when it was like how ancient that like hypothesis of how states, the phases, I guess, that states go through. And to see it go back, clear back to, Polybius during the Roman Republic, I think was interesting. And again, I didn't know how deep that, or how far back that analysis actually went. When he started talking about like the Enlightenment, that's where my kind of understanding where this analysis was starting to really become kind of popular, but obviously goes way back further. I was wondering though, if he was going to bring in, again, someone like Marx, who kind of ascribes to a lot of the elements of that cycle. But the difference with him, with someone like Marx, was then like advocating actually for the process of ending the oligarchy and then putting the control into the hands of the people, which would form a path towards basically communism, I guess, in the sense that the workers will control the means of production, and then possibly with the destination of a moneyless, stateless, classless society. And without necessarily saying that, if you're saying like, well, that's just what anarchy is going to be, Marx's ideas are going to be different from that because he was hypothesizing for other things. But you could definitely see, though, the progression, because like Marx talked about this as an analysis of history, that this is what happens. But the whole like going away from the oligarchy and seeing it historically go into like chaos and anarchy, but rather having it more of a unified front of the people, rather than anarchy just being like every man for himself, but actually coming together with that common purpose of taking over the oligarchy together as a, I guess, class conscious group of people, and developing class consciousness being like this mandatory vehicle there. I was wondering if what the connections might have been. So you guys that have maybe studied that interpretation, I'm wondering if if those connections actually existed with like Marx's analysis of history and the rise and fall of these empires. Anyway, with that being said, that was very informative. Tell me what you thought. Ask about your questions. What do you think about this analysis? You guys that, again, are really into Rome, looks like that's what this guy's background is. You can probably offer a good perspective, especially from Polybius's point of view. And you guys that really study, I guess, the rise and falls of civilizations, not from like that more Eurocentric point of view, but maybe other regions of the world. Do you think this model fits as well? So Polybius obviously looking at the sense of, probably, his world, but there's so much of the world too. Do you think that fits globally? All right, with that, you guys, we'll see y'all next time.